Democrats' fatal flaw, the party that forgot how to captivate America. And this is a big deal, right? Day before yesterday, Saturday, Donald Trump did a rally in Las Vegas. He was doing his no tax on tips mantra, because that was the thing that probably caused him to win Las Vegas. And by the time Facebook and Meta and X and TikTok and Instagram were done with the weekend, all of them now apparently having rewritten their algorithms so that they favored Republicans and Trump. I think it's safe to guess that Trump's rally probably got hundreds of millions of impressions. Meanwhile, over in the United States Senate, Chuck Schumer gave a speech condemning Trump, specifically for firing the inspectors general, the 18 inspectors general, the anti-corruption officers. We'll get into that in a little bit. But Chuck Schumer read let me read you this droning speech it's printed out here, and I've got the papers in front of me on this lectern, and I'm going to look down over my glasses and talk. Yeah, right. I mean, it was so boring. I watched part of it, and I don't remember what he said because it was so boring. Being media savvy and exploiting the hottest new media isn't a new thing. I mean, you'd think Democrats would have figured this out. Richard Nixon was a crook. But Americans didn't know that in 1960. In 1960, they just thought he was, Eisenhower's vice president. I mean, Jimmy Hoffa knew it. He bribed him, but that's a tangent. But he lost to John Kennedy in 1960, not because people knew he was a crook, but because he refused to wear makeup when he went on television to debate Kennedy and didn't play for the camera. He was not media savvy. He did not use this brand new medium. Now, people go, 1960, television was brand new? Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it came out in the 40s. But by the 50s, I mean, when I was a little kid growing up, the first couple of years, well, I don't remember my first years, but I remember vaguely when we got our first television when I was around 4 or 5, and I remember clearly when we got our first color television when I was like 10. Television was a new thing in 1960. It was the tail end of the 1950s. And it had just gone, everybody in America basically got one during the 1950s. And John F. Kennedy knew how to use television, and Richard Nixon didn't. And that's why Kennedy became president and Nixon didn't. Calvin Coolidge was the first president to use radio. He used it in a presidential address in 1923 when radio was just starting out. But the first really radio-savvy president was Franklin Roosevelt with his fireside chats, which started just a couple weeks after he was inaugurated with his famous, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. He was talking about, don't be afraid of the Great Depression, we're going to beat this thing. And every step along the way, throughout his presidency, whenever Franklin Roosevelt did something consequential, he went to the American people through radio and told them about it, using this hot new communications medium, radio. And how did the American people respond? They re-elected him 3 times. He was elected president. Franklin Roosevelt was elected president 4 times in a row. I guarantee you, if Joe Biden had done the same thing, or if Kamala Harris had done it as his surrogate, I mean, she was vice president. If Joe Biden or Kamala Harris had done the same thing, if every time they had a consequential success legislatively, every time they saw the economy get better, every time something, positive happened, and every time they beat the Republicans or the Republicans tried to do something stupid, if they had gone on social media, which is the new radio and television, roughly half of Americans now get all or much of their news from social media. If Biden or Harris had gone on social media every single time for 4 years that there was a success, right now, Donald Trump would not be sitting in the White House. It would be either Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. It's really that simple. And you know it, right? I'm not just blowing smoke here. You know that this is true. But instead, Biden basically hid out for 4 years. And Kamala Harris was like the great vanishing person. Meanwhile, Trump was out there every single day on social media, churning the media. I mean, Republicans looked at Jack Kennedy and his success in 1960 and said, holy cow, we need to get a media star like that. And thus, in 1980, we got a washed-up movie actor, a B-movie actor, Ronald Reagan, as president. And it worked for them. He could sell the American people anything because he'd been selling soap for GE on the GE television theater for years. They haven't been selling soap, he'd been selling GE televisions. But you get the point. We no longer live in the radio era. Radio advertising revenue is in the crapper right now. We no longer live in the television era. CNN is about to lay off 200 people. Television networks and stations are in distress. Radio has lost their revenue to podcasts. Television has lost their revenue to YouTube. And and the Washington Post, they're having to reinvent the newspaper because, nobody's reading it. In the 1930s, if it didn't happen on radio, it didn't happen. In the 1960s, if it didn't happen on television, it didn't happen. And today, if it doesn't happen on X or Facebook or Blue Sky or YouTube or TikTok, it didn't happen. Thomas Carlyle came up with this idea. He called it the great man theory of history back in the 1850s. He said that all these hinge points, the major hinge points of history, were turned by somebody who stepped forward and had great charisma and leadership skills. Well, we have people like that in the Democratic Party. And some of them, a few of them, a small handful of them are on social media. But the Democratic Party needs to figure this out. They need to start, aggressively recruiting and promoting people who have charisma and leadership talent, and they need to start using social media. If the Democrats don't start using political theater and fielding candidates who are talented enough to capture a social media audience, our country is doomed.